In the summer of 1984, a body was found buried in the woods of Northport, Long Island. A teenager stabbed dozens of times. His killer wasn't just any boy. He was Ricky Kasso, the self-styled Acid King. Was it murder for revenge or a satanic sacrifice that set off a nationwide panic?
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
A quiet harbor town shaken to its core by a gruesome discovery on Independence Day, 1984. Beneath the trees of Aztakea Woods lay the body of Gary Lauwers, a teenager brutally stabbed to death. The prime suspect, his friend Ricky Kasso, a troubled youth known as the Acid King. Almost overnight, whispers of satanic rituals and cult activity spread like wildfire, fueling the growing hysteria of the 1980s Satanic Panic. Was this the work of a devil-worshipping cult, or the tragic end of a young man lost to drugs? We're telling that story tonight. On the morning of July 4th, 1984, a police dog strained at its leash in a patch of trees behind Main Street in Northport, Long Island. The canine's handler pushed deeper into the brush until a sudden, stomach-turning odor confirmed the dog's alarm. Beneath a thin layer of leaves and earth lay the remains of a teenage boy. What police uncovered was ghastly. A partially decomposed skeleton, still clad in a denim vest, track pants, and Nike sneakers. The body's face was unrecognizable. Animals and decay had done their work, and one eye socket gaped, empty, in the skull. Dozens of stab wounds were visible in the victim's chest and back. Investigators at the scene knew immediately they had stumbled upon evidence of a brutal murder. Word of the discovery traveled fast through the quiet harbor town. The dead boy was soon identified as 17-year-old Gary Lauwers, a local youth who had been missing for 2 weeks. Within hours, suspicion fell on 2 other teenagers, peers of Gary's, who had been heard boasting about a killing. 17-year-old Ricky Acid King Kasso and his friend, 18-year-old Jimmy Troiano. Acting on an anonymous tip, police fanned out to locate the suspects. They found Ricky Kasso and Jimmy Troiano the very next day, passed out in a parked car, dirty and hungover, as if nothing were amiss. The 2 were arrested on July 5th, 1984, charged with second-degree murder in Lauwers' death. The following night, locked in a Suffolk County jail cell, Ricky Kasso scrawled a final note to his parents, and then hanged himself with a bedsheet, taking his secrets to the grave. For the shocked residents of Northport, it was almost inconceivable that local kids they had seen around town, could be responsible for such a depraved act. But in truth, the seeds of this tragedy had been planted long before that summer night. To understand how a Long Island teenager came to be stabbed to death in the woods, one has to know the strange journey of Ricky Kasso, the self-styled Acid King, and the troubled world he shared with Gary Lauwers. Richard Ricky Kasso Jr. grew up in the affluent suburbs of Northport, where his father was a popular high school history teacher and football coach. By all accounts, Ricky's early childhood was unremarkable. He was even a Little League athlete and model child, according to his father. But around junior high school, Ricky's personality began to change. He discovered drugs, starting with marijuana and quickly graduating to the potent hallucinogens that earned him his nickname. Classmates recalled that by 8th grade, he was never sober. Ricky could drop as many as 40 hits of acid in a day, chased with PCP and whatever else he could find. His friends often saw him wild-eyed and tripping, sometimes babbling about Satan or wandering local cemeteries at night in a drug-fueled haze. The once clean-cut coach's son transformed into a gaunt, long-haired dirtbag drifter, usually barefoot, often homeless, and perpetually high. As Ricky's drug abuse escalated, so did his erratic behavior. He fixated on occult imagery and heavy metal music, flaunting his interest in Satanism as a kind of rebellious persona. Ricky took to carrying Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible in his pocket, and would sometimes interrupt conversations with a random "Hail Satan." Most local teens thought it was an act, a provocative joke by a burnout who wanted to shock the adults. In truth, Ricky's occult antics were fairly superficial. He loved the dark aesthetics of bands like AC/DC, Black Sabbath, and Judas Priest, even scrawling pentagrams and 666 on walls. But there was no evidence he was engaged in real rituals or cult activities beyond getting high in graveyards and chanting Satan's name to the trees. Quote, "None of them actually worshiped the devil. It was an affectation, an aesthetic, designed more to piss off fundamental moralizers than anything," one observer noted of the local metalhead culture. Still, in Ricky's distorted, drug-addled mind, the line between posing and reality could blur. Friends recalled him claiming that he did try to commune with the devil on his solitary drug binges, tripping in the woods or the cemetery, sometimes digging into old graves in search of human bones for supposed rituals. Ricky's increasingly unhinged behavior alarmed his family. His parents tried multiple times to get him help. They enrolled him in a drug counseling program. He skipped the sessions and eventually had him admitted to a psychiatric hospital, the former Amityville Asylum, after he threatened suicide and proclaimed that death is the ultimate trip. But Ricky refused to cooperate with doctors, and that resistance would prove deadly. In one instance, Ricky managed to convince a psychiatric evaluator that he was neither violent nor truly delusional, telling them what they wanted to hear until the professionals concluded he was antisocial but not psychotic enough to involuntarily commit. Each time, As soon as he was released, Ricky went straight back to his habits. Eventually, his frustrated parents kicked the 16-year-old out of the house. Ricky took to sleeping in friends' garages, on park benches, or in the dense tangle of the Aztakea Woods, on the edge of town. Homeless and aimless, Ricky survived by dealing small quantities of drugs and relying on a loose clique of fellow teen runaways and dropouts. Among his closer companions were two other Northport boys, James Jimmy Troiano, a streetwise 18-year-old, and Albert Quiones, 17. Both shared Ricky's appetite for drugs. Also orbiting this group was Gary Lauwers, the boy who would later become Ricky's victim. Gary was the same age as Ricky. Like Ricky, he had struggled with school and family stability. He was known to run away from home for days or weeks at a time. Gary dabbled in drugs as well, though by many accounts, he wasn't as heavy a user as Kasso. In fact, Gary and Ricky had been friends. They'd hung out together, and at one point Gary even participated when Ricky decided to dig up a colonial-era grave in a local cemetery. Ricky had convinced a couple of his pals, Gary included, to help him unearth a grave, supposedly to obtain a skull and bones, either for sale or for use in a satanic ritual at the infamous Amityville Horror House on Walpurgisnacht. The grave-robbing escapade ended with Ricky's arrest in November 1983, when the police caught him with a stolen human skull and hand in his possession. It was an ominous sign of how far off the rails Ricky had drifted. Yet, even that incident would pale in comparison to what came next. Early in 1984, a betrayal sparked a feud between Ricky Kasso and Gary Lauwers. The two were partying together one night when Ricky passed out from too many drugs. Spotting an opportunity, Gary rummaged through Ricky's jacket and stole 10 bags of PCP, also known as angel dust, that Ricky had stashed to sell. It didn't take long for Ricky to realize his friend had robbed him. Enraged, Kasso confronted Gary, who admitted the theft and returned as much of the PCP as he hadn't already smoked or given away. 5 bags were gone, and Gary promised to pay Ricky $50 to make up for the loss. In the days that followed, Ricky did not let the matter rest. He was seen berating Gary and even physically beating him on several occasions to remind him of the debt. Gary, who had no steady income, scraped together what money he could and paid Ricky back in small installments. By mid-June 1984, it was said that Gary had finally squared the $50 debt in full. Friends later testified that the two boys seemed to have reconciled and that Ricky was no longer actively hostile to Gary. In hindsight, this calm was the eye of the storm, a brief pause before Ricky's simmering resentments and drug-fueled delusions would explode into violence. On June 19, 1984, Ricky Kasso crossed paths with Gary Lauwers again. It was a warm Tuesday night at the beginning of summer, and Ricky had plans to get high out in the woods with his usual crew. He invited Gary to join him, along with Jimmy Troiano and Albert Quiones. At first, Gary was hesitant. He and Ricky weren't exactly best friends after the PCP incident. but Ricky enticed him with a trivial gesture. He offered to buy jelly donuts for everyone before they headed into the woods. Gary, perhaps eager to belong and believing the beef was behind them, agreed to come along for what sounded like a casual night of partying under the stars. That night, the 4 teens, and according to some later reports, a couple of other hangers-on who would depart early, trekked into the Aztakea Woods, a small patch of forest near Northport's town park, carrying drugs and a portable radio. They found a little clearing beneath the trees and set about building a campfire. Recent rain had soaked the brush, so the boys struggled to keep a fire going. Gary even pulled off his own socks and cut the denim sleeves from his jacket to use as kindling, sacrificing pieces of his clothing to coax the flames. The mood was initially light, just a group of bored suburban teens getting high in their usual spot. As the fire crackled fitfully, they passed around what they believed were hits of mescaline, in reality likely low-grade LSD, and smoked several bags of PCP. In total, by some estimates, the 4 consumed dozens of doses of acid and an astonishing quantity of angel dust over the course of the night. Reality soon began to slip. Time lost meaning. In the darkness of the Aztakea Woods, the stage was set for horror. As midnight passed, the drug cocktail took hold. The atmosphere in the woods turned strange and volatile. Each survivor of that night would later recall the sequence of events a little differently, fragmented as their memories were by intoxication and trauma. But the broad strokes can be pieced together from their accounts. At some point in the haze of hallucinations around the dying campfire, an argument erupted between Ricky and Gary. One account has it that Ricky bizarrely demanded Gary take off his clothes and throw them into the fire as an offering, which Gary refused. In any case, harsh words were exchanged, and years of pent-up anger in Ricky suddenly came surging to the surface. Ricky snapped. He pounced on Gary without warning, knocking him to the ground. Gary's yelp of surprise quickly turned to screams. What followed was a frenzy of brutality that lasted anywhere from several minutes to several hours, depending on who told the story. In the initial scuffle, Ricky Kasso sank his teeth into Gary Lauwers' neck, literally trying to bite him like an animal. Gary broke free momentarily, but Ricky was in a violent rage. Jimmy Troiano either froze in shock or actively joined the assault. Accounts conflicted on this critical point. Quijones would later claim Troiano helped hold Gary down, then recanted that claim. Gary tried to fight back, but he stood little chance. Ricky pulled out a long-bladed knife. The blade flashed in the dim firelight, and then it plunged into Gary's body. Gary cried out as Ricky stabbed him again and again in a wild fury. "I love you, Satan," Ricky hissed at his former friend as he pinned him to the ground. Gary, bleeding and terrified, refused. "I love my mother," he managed to choke out instead. His defiance only enraged Ricky further. In a scene almost too gruesome to imagine, Ricky Kasso continued to scab Gary Lauwers, dozens of times. In the back, in the chest, even in the face. At some point, Gary did manage to stagger to his feet in a desperate bid to escape. But the woods were dark and his injuries severe. Ricky tackled him before he could get away. The knife rose and fell relentlessly as Gary begged for mercy. Finally, after perhaps upward of 32 stab wounds, Gary Lauwers went limp. In the eerie silence that followed, only the crackle of the fire and the panting breaths of the attackers could be heard. Jimmy Troiano later admitted that he helped Ricky drag Gary's bloodied, twitching body out of the firelight and deeper into the woods. There they dropped him among the ferns and undergrowth. Incredibly, as they turned to leave, Gary suddenly stirred, his body reflexively sitting up in shock or final agony. Ricky Kasso let out a curse, startled that his victim was somehow still alive. With a manic gleam in his eye, Ricky rushed back at Gary's prone form. He brought the knife down again and again into Gary's face and head, determined to finish the job. When he finally stepped back, Gary Lauwers was silent and still. One of the blows had sliced into Gary's left eye socket, and now the eye was destroyed. Blood pooled into the dirt. The teen's lifeless body was a ruin of stab wounds and mutilation. Standing over the corpse of his friend turned victim, Ricky Kasso began to laugh. Troiano would later recall the sight of Ricky, shirtless, smeared in blood, chest heaving, throwing his head back and cackling as if the murder were some great joke. The night had descended into a nightmare, far beyond any drug hallucination. Before leaving the scene, Ricky knelt and performed a final, macabre gesture. He started chanting to Satan over Gary's body. No one present could recall the exact words of the chant, only that Ricky's muttered invocations to the devil echoed through the dark pines. In Ricky's own later telling, he claimed that at that moment, a black crow suddenly fluttered down and perched nearby, cawing loudly, a sign Ricky believed of Satan's approval of the sacrifice. Whether that eerie detail was real or just one more drug-fueled delusion, only Ricky would ever know. In the immediate aftermath of the killing, Ricky Kasso, Jimmy Troiano, and Albert Quijones fled the woods, leaving Gary Lauwers' mutilated body where it had fallen. The adrenaline high of violence quickly gave way to panic. Back in town, the trio made a pact. They would never speak of what had happened in Aztakea Woods. Ricky tossed his bloody knife off a bridge into the harbor, trying to eliminate evidence. The boys swore each other to secrecy, and, initially, all three kept that oath. But Ricky Kasso was not one to stay quiet for long. In the days following the murder, the 17-year-old seemed almost proud of his gruesome deed. He began bragging to his inner circle of friends about how he had wasted Gary Lauwers. Ricky recounted the horrific details with a disturbing glee, even imitating how Gary had begged for his life. At first, most of the teens who heard Ricky's story refused to believe him. It was just Too grotesque, too extreme. Northport was a sleepy, safe town. Kids like them didn't really go around killing each other in satanic rituals. Did they? Some laughed it off or thought Ricky was merely having a sick drug fantasy. But Ricky was determined to prove he was telling the truth. Over the next week or so, he led at least a dozen different teens on treks into Aztakea Woods to show off Gary's rotting corpse as a kind of trophy. He'd guide curious peers to the shallow glen where Gary lay among the ferns, point at the maggot-ridden remains, and boast, "See, I told you I killed him." Shockingly, not one of those young onlookers immediately reported the crime to the police or to their parents. Some were simply too frightened of Ricky to dare to cross him. Others assumed someone else would eventually speak up. The code of silence held for 2 weeks. In the meantime, Ricky and Jimmy even decided to bury the evidence of their crime, literally. As the summer heat began accelerating the decomposition of Gary's body, the stench around the murder site grew overpowering. Acting on a morbid suggestion from one of the kids he'd taken to view the corpse, Ricky and Jimmy returned to the site several days after the killing with shovels. They hastily dug a shallow grave next to Gary's remains and rolled his body into it, covering him loosely with dirt and leaves. During this gruesome task, Gary's corpse was so decayed that his skull separated from his body, a sight that reportedly made Ricky chuckle in amusement. To any normal person, it was a scene of absolute horror. To Ricky Kasso, it was just another crazy story to laugh about. By the end of June 1984, Ricky Kasso and Jimmy Troiano believed they had gotten away with murder. Gary Lauwers' disappearance had not even been formally reported. His parents, sadly accustomed to their son running away for days at a time, hadn't immediately alerted police that Gary was missing. With Gary's corpse now hidden under the dirt, he talked about leaving town to get a fresh start elsewhere. He and Jimmy made half-baked plans to hitchhike across the country to California, where they imagined they could live freely, dealing drugs and partying on the West Coast. In early July, they set off to put this plan into motion, heading west out of New York. But youthful impulsiveness got the better of them. They only made it as far as Chicago before they grew bored or homesick and turned back. In a grim twist of fate, by the time Ricky and Jimmy drove back into Northport in a cheap used car, bought with the proceeds of selling drugs along the way, the dominoes on their undoing had already begun to fall. It was a teenage girl who finally broke the silence. Disturbed by the rumors she'd overheard, this unnamed young woman called the Suffolk County Police on July 1st, 1984, and reported that a boy had been murdered in Aztakea Woods. At first, the police were skeptical. There was no missing person report, no evidence beyond schoolyard whispers. But given the specificity of the tip, officers decided to investigate the wooded area. On July 4th, guided by cadaver dogs, they found Gary Lauwers' shallow grave, and exhumed his remains. The crime could no longer be hidden. Later that night, as Ricky and Jimmy partied obliviously with friends to celebrate the 4th of July, a neighbor noticed their parked car and, recalling the recent talk of a murder, phoned in a tip about the vehicle. When police arrived and discovered the two teens asleep inside, they moved swiftly to apprehend them. Ricky Kasso and Jimmy Troiano woke to find themselves surrounded by 18 officers with guns drawn. The game was up at last. In custody, Ricky Kasso at first denied everything. It didn't last long. Presented with evidence and facing the reality of prison, Ricky confessed to the murder within hours of his arrest. According to one police account, he admitted he had been shouting, quote, "satanic stuff," while stabbing Gary, an allusion to the now famous demand, "say he loves Satan." Jimmy Troiano, on the other hand, maintained that while he had been present, he hadn't participated in killing Gary. Albert Quijones, the third teen from that night, had also been picked up by police. Sensing an opportunity to save himself, Quijones immediately agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He gave a statement aligning with Ricky's basic confession, but also initially claimed that Troiano had helped restrain Gary during the murder. Based on Quijones' testimony and Ricky's own partial confession, both Ricky Kasso and Jimmy Troiano were charged with second-degree murder and held without bail. Just 2 days later, on July 7th, 1984, Ricky Kasso was found dead in his jail cell, an apparent suicide by hanging. His short, turbulent life ended at age 17, robbing the public of any fuller accounting for his actions. But, in a way, the legend of Ricky Kasso was only beginning. In the absence of the killer himself, a sensational narrative rushed in to fill the void, one that would cast the events in Aztakea Woods as something far more occult and elaborate than the ugly reality of a drug-fueled teen murder. Ricky Kasso's arrest and shocking death made headlines, but it was the manner of Gary Lauwers' murder that truly seized the public's imagination. Almost overnight, the Northport case morphed into a media frenzy about a satanic sacrifice in the suburbs. Local authorities fanned the flames early. A Suffolk County detective told reporters that Kasso was a member of a satanic cult and that a whole throng of chanting devil worshippers had participated or at least witnessed the killing. This alarming claim of roving teen cultists spilling blood for the devil brought journalists from far and wide clamoring into Northport. The press dutifully repeated the most salacious details. They reported that Kasso had butchered his friend as part of an occult ritual, that he had cut out Gary's eyes, and that he had compelled the victim to profess love for Satan as he died. These elements made for lurid copy and struck a nerve with a nation already on edge about deviant youth culture. By 1984, the United States was in the grip of the early Satanic Panic, a period of hysteria in which everyday citizens came to believe satanic cults were corrupting children from within schools, daycare, music, and games. Now, here was a real-life horror story, seemingly confirming those fears. A nice Long Island town, its ordinary teenagers turned into devil-worshipping murderers. It was a moral crusader's nightmare come true. Television and newspapers eagerly amplified the satanic angle. The notorious line, "Say you love Satan," became the case's catchphrase, splashed in bold type across tabloids and repeated on TV newscasts. Within weeks, Ricky Kasso's scowling mugshot, taken at his arraignment, eyes wild beneath disheveled hair, an AC/DC concert t-shirt hanging from his skinny frame, became an iconic image of adolescent evil. Parents across the country stared at that photo in horror and disbelief. How could a seemingly average kid descend into such depravity? For some, the answer was simple: rock music, drugs, and the devil. The fact that Ricky had been wearing an AC/DC t-shirt at the time of his arrest was seized upon as evidence that heavy metal music was a gateway to Satanism. Pundits pointed to Ricky's interest in the Satanic Bible and occult symbols as proof that an underground satanic movement was ensnaring the youth. One television special after another gravely intoned that the Northport murder was prima facie proof of Satan's influence lurking in American suburbia. Even mainstream programs like ABC's 2020 ran segments on the case, and in 1988, Geraldo Rivera devoted a portion of his infamous primetime expose, Devil Worship Exposing Satan's Underground, to the Lauwers murder.
Whether a Satan exists is a matter of belief, but we are certain that Satanism exists. To some, it's a religion. To others, it's the practice of evil in the devil's name. It exists, and it's flourishing. Members of our studio audience tonight will attest to that. They are friends and foes of Satanism, devil worshippers and law enforcers, experts and victims. They'll help us understand this force that exalts evil and darkness. We'll be asking why. Why does it exist? And why does it appeal to so many vulnerable people, especially the young? Now, the very young and the impressionable should definitely not be watching this program tonight. This is not a Halloween fable. This is a real-life horror story, and it will give small children bad dreams. As for teenagers and their parents, we hope you are watching, because it's teenagers who are most likely to fall under the spell of this jumble of dark, violent emotions called Satanism, and in some cases, to be driven into committing terrible deeds.
The narrative was clear. Ricky Kasso was not just a disturbed kid, but the tip of a demonic iceberg threatening the country's children. Yet, amid the media circus, the facts told a far less sensational story. As investigators dug deeper, the supposed cult aspect of the Northport murder quickly fell apart. The rumored throng of robed Satanists in the woods proved to be non-existent. A phantom conjured from Kasso's own boasts and early police exaggeration. There was a local clique grandiosely calling themselves the Knights of the Black Circle, but they were essentially a handful of stoner teens who sold pot and occasionally talked tough about occultism. They bore no resemblance to an organized satanic cult. And in fact, Ricky Kasso was never even a core member of that group. The lurid claim that Kasso had carved out Gary's eyes as part of a ritual was also unsupported. The autopsy indicated Gary's eyes had been damaged by stab wounds and decomposition, not removed with any surgical precision. And while Ricky had indeed invoked Satan during the crime, there was zero evidence that the murder was premeditated as a sacrifice, or that it was carried out according to any occult plan. The truth appeared to be that Ricky Kasso murdered Gary Lauwers in a haze of rage and narcotics for reasons as banal as revenge over stolen drugs and the twisted thrill it gave him. The devil did not make him do it. If anything, the drugs did. Of course, these nuances did little to stem the tide of panic. By late 1984, communities far from Long Island were reacting to the Northport story, and others like it, with sweeping measures. School districts banned heavy metal t-shirts and albums, fearing they were talismans of satanic influence. Church groups held record-burning rallies to destroy demonic music. Popular role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons fell under suspicion. In the public consciousness, Ricky Kasso became the teen face of devil worship and the dangers of rebellious youth culture. It was easier for many to believe that supernatural evil had possessed Ricky than to confront the mundane horror of how badly the adults in his life had failed him. After all, facing the Kasso case as a drug-fueled tragedy of parental neglect, mental illness, and broken systems was uncomfortable. Far more convenient was to label Ricky simply as a satanic monster and view his crime as an isolated eruption of otherworldly evil. With Ricky Kasso dead by his own hand, the job of publicly reckoning with the Aztakea Woods murder fell to the trial of Jimmy Troiano. Troiano was the only one of the trio still facing charges for Gary Lauwers' death. His trial began in April of 1985 in a courthouse in Riverhead, Long Island. It had been nearly a year since the murder, and the initial media furor had cooled somewhat. Still, the specter of Satanism hung over the proceedings. Troiano, now 19, stood accused of second-degree murder on the theory that he had actively assisted Kasso. The prosecution's case largely hinged on the testimony of Albert Quiones, who, under his immunity deal, recounted the events of June 19th and originally had implicated Troiano in helping to restrain the victim. But Quiones was a problematic witness. For one, he freely admitted that he had been extremely high on LSD and PCP that night, as had everyone present. Under oath, Quiones even conceded that his memory of the attack was hazy and that he might have been mistaken about Troiano's role. In fact, by the time of trial, Quiones reversed his earlier story and testified that Troiano had not physically assisted Kasso in the murder after all. This flip-flop severely weakened the prosecution's case. Troiano's defense attorney capitalized on it, arguing that the truth of what happened in the woods was impossible to pin down, given the hallucinogenic fog everyone was under. Quote, "It's hard to remember exactly what happened when the trees are melting and the stars are rushing around, Troiano had told his lawyer, referring to the profound drug-induced distortions of that night. With no physical evidence tying Troiano to actually stabbing or restraining Gary, only Kasso's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, which was never recovered anyway. And with Keone's credibility in tatters, the jury was left with ample reasonable doubt. After a 3-day deliberation, the verdict came on April 25th, 1985. Not guilty. Jimmy Troiano was acquitted of all charges in the death of Gary Lauwers. In the end, the justice system officially deemed Ricky Kasso the sole party responsible for the murder, a conclusion which, sensationalism aside, aligns with the evidence that Kasso was the one who wielded the knife and orchestrated the assault. Troiano, the court decided, had the misfortune of being present, but was not proven to be an active participant in the slaying. He walked free, another life derailed, but not legally guilty in the eyes of the law. The trial's outcome received only modest coverage compared to the initial hysteria. There were no bold headlines for Troiano's acquittal. A teenager not guilty of being a satanic murderer was far less newsworthy than a lurid ritual killing. But in the courtroom, at least, a kind of truth had prevailed. The verdict underscored what calmer reflection had suggested all along. The Northport murder was not a grand conspiracy of devil worshippers, but rather the tragic culmination of a troubled boy's downward spiral. As one Suffolk County detective later admitted, the case was, quote, 100% a drug debt murder between kids who were high as hell, not some premeditated satanic sacrifice. The ritual trappings had been largely improvised and amplified by rumor. When stripped of that sensational veneer, what remained was a tale as old as any in the annals of crime. A tale of youthful rage, substance abuse, and lost innocence. In the wake of the trial, Northport tried to return to normalcy, but the story of Ricky Kasso left a lingering scar on the community and an indelible mark on 1980s pop culture. The so-called Satanic Panic would rage on for years after 1984, and the Acid King would often be cited as a prime example of where moral depravity could lead. The case inspired songs, books, and films, mostly exploitative, that took varying degrees of creative license with the facts. One paperback true crime book, published in 1987, was even titled, "Say You Love Satan," cashing in on the infamous line. It presented a highly dramatized version of the story, so much so that the author was accused of plagiarizing portions of a Rolling Stone article and fabricating details for shock value. The media had built up the Kasso case in a modern myth of devil worship, and that myth had legs. It tapped into a vein of paranoia that was running deeply through American society at the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, the murder in Aztakea Woods less like a satanic rite and more like a preventable tragedy of youth. Ricky Kasso was a severely drug-addicted, mentally unstable teenager who fell through the cracks. He was kicked out of a comfortable home into a life of homelessness and constant narcotic use. He repeatedly cried out for help in his own way, through jokes about suicide, extreme behavior, grave robbing. Yet the interventions never stuck. It is easier, perhaps, to blame the devil than to ask how a 17-year-old became so lost in the first place. The moral panic of the 1980s fixated on Satan as an external invading force, but in doing so, it ignored the very real demons of depression, addiction, and familial failure that plagued kids just like Ricky. As one commentator noted, no one wants to acknowledge that Ricky's seemingly normal parents kicked out their mentally ill teenage son, leaving him to sleep in the woods. No one wants to look at the fact that Kasso started doing serious drugs at such an early age, a red flag of abuse or trauma. Those uncomfortable truths got buried beneath the lurid symbolism of satanic cults and heavy metal scapegoating. Today, the name Ricky Kasso still sends a shiver through those who remember the case. The oak and scrub pine of Aztakea Woods have long since grown over any sign of blood or shallow graves. But the story endures. A cautionary tale recounted on true crime shows and whispered in local legend. It endures because it sits at the crossroads of American anxieties, the vulnerability of youth, the destructiveness of drugs, and the seductive fear of the occult. In the end, the real devil that came to Northport was not a horned beast in the woods, but the more familiar combination of rage, drugs, and delusion inside a troubled boy. Gary Lauwers lost his life to that darkness, and an entire generation of parents, politicians, and pastors nearly lost their wits to the ensuing panic. The night in Aztakea Woods will never be forgotten, but it is remembered most clearly, not as a tale of satanic ritual, but as a sobering lesson in how easily fact can be overtaken by fear. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com, and produced by Dan Wilder, with original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.